Currently, Earth. On June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn is formally crowned Queen Consort of England. King Henry VIII of England and Queen Anne Boleyn formally married on June 25th, 1533, after a secret wedding on November 14th, 1532. On May 23rd, 1533, newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon's marriage null and void. 5 days later, he declared Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's marriage valid. Shortly afterwards, Pope Clement VII excommunicated Henry and Cranmer. As a result of this marriage and these excommunications, the first break between the Church of England and Rome took place, and the king took control of the Church of England. On September 7th, 1533, Queen Anne gave birth to future Queen Elizabeth I. Henry was disappointed to have a daughter rather than a son, but hoped a son would follow, and professed to love Elizabeth. Anne subsequently had 3 miscarriages, and by March 1536, Henry was courting Jane Seymour. In order to marry Jane Seymour, Henry VIII had to find reasons to end his marriage to Anne Boleyn. Henry VIII had Anne investigated for high treason in April 1536. On May 2nd, she was arrested and sent to the Tower of London, where she was tried before a jury of peers, including Henry Percy, her former betrothed, and her uncle, Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. She was convicted on May 15th and continued her eternity 4 days later. Modern historians view the charges against her, which included adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king, as highly unconvincing. On June 1st of 1812, President James Madison declared war on Great Britain. This war had been preceded by years of diplomatic dispute, yet neither side was ready for war when it came. Britain was heavily engaged in the Napoleonic Wars. Most of the British Army was deployed in the Peninsular War in Portugal and Spain, and the Royal Navy was blockading most of the coast of Europe. The number of British regular troops present in Canada in July 1812 was officially 6,034, supported by additional Canadian militia. The United States was also not prepared for war. Madison had assumed that the state militias would easily seize Canada and that negotiations would follow. In 1812, the regular army consisted of fewer than 12,000 men. Congress authorized the expansion of the army to 35,000 men, but the service was voluntary and very unpopular. It paid poorly, and there were initially few trained and experienced officers. Most American militia at the time objected to serving outside of their home states. When American militias were called to fight in unfamiliar territory outside of their home state during this time period, they were reported as being undisciplined and having poor performance. Multiple militias refused orders to cross the border and fight on Canadian soil. The main reasons for the war's cause was a response to the British economic blockade of France, the induction of American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and British support of Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. A faction of Congress known as the War Hawks had been advocating war with Great Britain for several years and had not hidden their hopes that a U.S. invasion of Canada might result in significant territorial land gains for the United States. In the months after President Madison proclaimed the state of war to be in effect, American forces launched a three-point invasion of Canada, all of which were decisively unsuccessful. In 1814, with Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire collapsing, the British were able to allocate more military resources to the American war. As a result of the British allocating extra troops, Washington, D.C. fell, and in August of 1814, British troops burned the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for the earlier burnings of government buildings in Canada by U.S. soldiers. The next month in September, the tide of the war changed. At the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay on Lake Champlain, Thomas McDonough's American naval force took home a decisive victory for the home team. The invading British Army had to turn around and go back to Canada. Our country's victory on Lake Champlain led to the conclusion of U.S.-British peace negotiations in Belgium. On December 24th of 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, formally ending the War of 1812. Key points of the Treaty of Ghent were that all conquered territory was to be returned and a commission would be established to settle the boundary of the United States and Canada. On June 1st, 1963, Jomo Kenyatta became Kenya's first indigenous head of government. Jomo Kenyatta was believed to be born in the East African highlands, southwest of Mount Kenya, sometime in the late 1890s. He was a member of the Kikuyu ethnic group, Kenya's largest, and was educated by Presbyterian missionaries. By 1920, Kenya formally became a British colony, and by 1921, Kenyatta was living in the colonial capital of Nairobi. There he became involved in African nationalist movements, and by 1928 had risen to the post of General Secretary of the Kikuyu Central Association, an organization opposed to the seizure of tribal land by European settlers. Jomo Kenyatta's first trip to London was in 1929 to protest colonial policy, but the authorities there refused to meet with him. Over the course of the next few years, Jomo Kenyatta returned to London to petition for African rights, and then remained in Europe in the 1930s to receive a formal education at various institutions, including Moscow University. In 1938, he published his seminal work, Facing Mount Kenya, which praised traditional Kikuyu society and discussed its plight under colonial rule. During World War II, he lived in England, lecturing and writing. In 1946, he returned to Kenya, and in 1947 became president of the newly formed Kenya African Union. He pushed for majority rule, recruiting both Kikuyus and non-Kikuyus into the nonviolent movement, but the white settler minority was unyielding in refusing a significant role for blacks in the colonial government. In 1952, an extremist Kikuyu group called Mau Mau began a guerrilla war against the settlers and colonial government, leading to bloodshed, political turmoil, and the forced internment of tens of thousands of Kikuyus in detainment camps. Kenyatta played little role in the rebellion, but he was vilified by the British and put on trial in 1952 with 5 other KUA leaders for, quote, managing the Mau Mau terrorist organization, unquote. An advocate of nonviolence and conservatism, he pleaded innocent in the highly politicized trial, but was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He spent 6 years in jail and then was sent to an internal exile at Lodwar, where he lived under house arrest. Meanwhile, the British government slowly began steering Kenya to black majority rule. In 1960, the Kenyan Africa National Union was organized by black nationalists, and Kenyatta was elected president in absentia. The party announced it would not take part in any government until Kenyatta was freed. Kenyatta pledged the protection of settlers' rights in an independent Kenya, and on August 14, 1961, he was finally allowed to return to Kikuyu land. After a week of house arrest in the company of his family and supporters, He was formally released on August 21st. In 1962, he went to London to negotiate Kenyan independence, and in May 1963, he led the Kenyan African National Union to victory in pre-independence elections. On December 12, 1963, Kenya celebrated its independence, and Kenyatta formally became prime minister. The next year, a new constitution established Kenya as a republic, and Kenyatta was elected president. Jomo Kenyatta remained Kenya's president from 1964 until he continued his eternity in 1978. On June 1st in 1980, the cable news network, aka CNN, the world's first 24-hour television news network, made its debut. The network signed on from its headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, with a lead story about the attempted assassination of civil rights leader Vernon Jordan. CNN set out to show the world that news was just too frequent to be limited to a once-a-day event. At the time, TV news was dominated by three major networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, in their nightly 30-minute broadcasts. CNN was the brainchild of Robert Ted Turner, born on November 19, 1938 in Cincinnati. As a child, Ted moved with his family to Georgia, where his father ran a successful billboard advertising company. Ted's father continued his eternity in 1963, in turn, leaving Ted to take over and expand the family business. Ted purchased a failing Atlanta TV station that broadcast old movies and network reruns in 1970. Within a few years, he transformed his investment into a superstation, a concept he pioneered in which the station was beamed by satellite into homes across the country. Turner later bought the Atlanta Braves baseball team and the Atlanta Hawks basketball team and aired their games on his network, TBS, Turner Broadcasting System. In 1977, Turner gained international fame when he sailed his yacht to victory in the prestigious America's Cup race. In its first years of operation, CNN lost money and was ridiculed as the Chicken Noodle Network. But Turner continued to invest in building up the network. And get ready for the power move. In 1983, Ted Turner bought the Satellite News Channel, owned in part by ABC, and thereby eliminated CNN's main competitor. CNN eventually came to be known for covering live events around the world as they happened, often beating the major networks to the punch. The network gained significant traction with its live coverage of the Persian Gulf War in 1991, and the network's audience grew along with the increasing popularity of cable television during the 1990s and well into the new millennium. The verbal content on this audiogram pertaining to history can be found on history.com.